The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to everyone. How you all doing? This is a live show for those that may not know it, because we've been doing a lot of reruns. So we have an important topic for today, and I hope people get something out of this. So the first thing I want to do is to really thank the viewers for all your support over these past 4 years. And this has become a family. And I want you all to know that I really appreciate. I really appreciate your support. And my screen is kind of dark. Can you lighten it up? Okay, when you get in, check it out. I'll talk to you later. So one of the things that has been happening on this show is we've had a broad overview of a lot of different subjects on history and culture, politics, a whole range of subjects. And generally the way the show's gone up to now is that each show has been based on kind of inspiration, the way you do jazz, and I'm going to continue to do that. But there's going to be a lot more systematic planning to the shows as we go on. So I'll be consulting people who are serious viewers of the show for your ideas. Brother Ugawa has reached out to some already, and I'll be talking to others. And so there'll be a series of things that we'll be covering. And while it's going to be more systematic in planning, one of the things that's going to be key to how this show works from now on is one, trying to answer a broad question that I've heard a fair number of our people ask, and that is, how do we handle this situation we're in right now? So that is going to be an overriding concern as the show goes on. There'll be many things. We haven't been covering current events in Africa, for example. We have covered a little bit of Haiti, but there's a lot more we need to deal with. And there's a whole question of Africa's development and how it's going to move. So that will be key. But my overriding concern is going to be, and it's beyond this show, but it includes this show, is the shaping of a grand strategy for rebuilding Black families and communities in the United States and globally, in Africa and the Caribbean, in Europe, wherever we are as a people. And that's going to take more than this show, because this is a question of organizing. And I think it's a big mistake if people focus their primary attention on the internet. But it's important that we deal with this. And so this is why I put 4 years into this show. And I really want to thank the people who have made financial contributions, because this show has cost me close to $50,000 over 4 years, and that's not going to continue. So I'm going to say right now that it would be helpful if I could get some pledges from people to donate $10 a month or whatever. And if I get, because right now the basic operation of this show, yearly, the basic is $6,000. But when I started, it was much more. And it's much more because there's more that I do than just the basic cost of putting the show on. And I have a person, Cinnabar, who I pay. So it would be helpful if there was some consistent monthly donations, if it's only $10, if that's all you can afford, whatever you can, because I'm not making any money on this. This show has enough dedicated viewers. We've gone to 9,000. It's not great compared to the big shows, but actually 20% of those watch every show. And we've got strong listenership in Africa and the Caribbean and Europe. And of course, our main listenership and viewership is in the United States. So to keep this show going, I need some help, because I can't continue to do this. And I could get the money, and that would be through taking ads. And I'm not going to take ads. I come out of Black Liberation Movement and self-reliance, which is something I learned from Marcus Garvey, but also it's basic to my nature, is real key. So there are a few people who donate so much time, I don't expect nothing from them, but those that can, put up your little $5 or $10 a month. And it's appreciated that some have made contributions. And I know people aren't rich. And I'm making no money for this. I'm not doing this for money. If I did, I'd be broke, because I wouldn't be making any. But overall, and what we'll be addressing overall, which I've done from the beginning, is long-term and short-term strategies for freeing our minds and for freeing our people. And that has been the overall approach to this show. So some of the things I'm going to discuss today, which is basically one topic, really flows out of that. And so we've had a lot of programs that have been topical and timely. And that's what this one is today. But we've also had the long view. I just want to say this in terms of the greatest weakness, one of the greatest weaknesses of the United States, which in some ways makes me happy, is that it lacks a grand strategy. I mean, it stumbles into this and that, and it's usually war, and it's usually ways for people to enrich themselves, that is, those who are in power. So the lack of a grand strategy in the US is also part of what brings this country to where it's at right now, but it also contributes to why it's in decline. So we're in a crisis period now. People who thought that because some people said, oh, you're trying to scare us with this stuff for Project 2025, you're trying to scare us. And then some said, oh, no, this can't be real. They're not going to do this. Are you kidding? You know what I mean? Sister Briscoe asked, are you going to offer some type of subscription that takes the money monthly? Yes, I will. And you can help me in advising me on that, on how I do that. But I hadn't thought of that approach. But yes, you can help me out. And you can contact, God will get in touch with you and we can talk. And then through that, I'll get in touch with you. You give me some ideas on that. So this is a tough period we're going through. And this is the second post-Reconstruction. And I'm starting the show 4 years ago, I laid that out. And that was on the eve of us defeating Trump, which we didn't give ourselves too much credit for. And that may be one of the reasons why he could come back, because we tend to underestimate our own powers. And some of the folks who helped make this happen, they're hardly mentioned. Black Lives Matter, for example, and the bungling of Trump and the handling of COVID. And this last election was close. Trump won by 2,300,000 votes. So anybody that's talking about he has a mandate, well, he's going to take one, but he doesn't have one. The country split. But 6 million of Harris's supporters didn't show up. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we've gone through some of this before. I'm not going to spend much time on it, except to say that the Democrats made the major mistake, Harris and her campaign, in not really addressing the pain that this country is facing, not just blacks, but just about everybody, except those on the top with solutions. She had some, but they were kitchen table solutions. And so we've discussed this before. It would take a lot to bring out more than the people who are just opposed to Trump. Because if you're really going to win in something like this, then you have to address people's needs in a sincere way that, then encourages them to take some action. And so I've discussed this before. It meant mainly going to people that hadn't voted before. But you had to go with the program. So this was a real weakness, especially since Harris had something real strong to run on, which was Biden's infrastructure, chips, environmental reindustrialization program of 1.9 trillion that then drew 3 or 4 more from the corporate sector and left the economy in real good shape. Black people have the lowest unemployment rate they've had in a long time. But the main thing is these policies were a break from how the Democrats have normally acted doing not much more than the Republicans. And so this was, in line with Roosevelt's New Deal in terms of how he addressed that emergency. Johnson, who had to respond to the Black freedom movement and came up with civil rights and voting rights, Great Society legislation, which, by the way, has been put down. I was just reading one of our great scholars who was doing an assessment. He's no longer alive. He was doing an assessment of the movements of the 60s. The book came out in 1968 and had a good assessment of King, except that he didn't see what his real victories were, which was voting rights and civil rights. And this book was written in 68. So these were passed in 65. And saw the war on poverty program as just a waste. Well, this guy's a real good thinker, and a brilliant thinker, but not an organizer, and it's pretty obvious. And I've told you, we were the first. This was when we were transitioning from the Black freedom movement of the Congress of Racial Equality, and we were forming what is now the Pan-African People's Organization that's been in operation since 1966. And that's when I moved to take over the War on Poverty program. And it gave us the money to organize 45,000 Black people block by block. And the only move that's been done like that in the Black liberation movement in the history of this country, which is a shame, which is telling you Black people ain't dealing with, the nationalist sector I'm going to deal with specifically, and the so-called radical Black sector are not dealing with real power. If you don't organize the masses of your people where they are systematically, then you're not dealing with power. And so we come up with the slogan of Black Power, and we rally behind that. That was a slogan. That wasn't a program. So the person I'm referring to that made these observations was James Boggs, who was a brilliant social thinker, a automobile factory worker with a high school education, married to Grace Lee Boggs, who had a PhD from Bryn Mawr. She's Chinese American, both of them radical, one Black, one Chinese American. But he couldn't see that that program wasn't going to end poverty, for sure. He saw that, but he couldn't see what could be done with it. Why do I make that reference? Because what Biden laid out provided some useful instruments that we can use in organizing. And to the extent that they stay around, we should use them. It's going to be very hard for Trump to eliminate the chips part of the program. Why? Because more of those chip factories are in red states than blue, but also because he had a chips program that he never followed through with because, of Trump, So it's possible that he'll continue chips and take credit for it. And that's Biden's problem because Biden didn't do a good job of publicizing his own stuff. Neither did Obama, though he didn't have much to publicize. He had something. He didn't do it. So my point is that as we're looking at this time, which is the second post-Reconstruction that started in 1968, which is a period that parallels the first post-Reconstruction that started in 1876. And this is where the system tries to roll back your gains. So what we've seen in terms of the MAGA movement and stuff like that, Make America Great Again, which translates Make America White Again, this is a movement that is trying to restore the whiteness of America. And so that's what we're dealing with, but it's like going up against the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean because the demographics go against that. And so as over time, we begin to respond as a people to this, and use this crisis as an opportunity to rebuild families and communities in the US, African nations in the Caribbean, and in Africa and the South Pacific, and the lives of African people in Europe. As we face this second post-Reconstruction, it's going to require us to draw on the greatest strengths we have. And the greatest strength we have is our culture, which we underestimate. And there are many things lacking in the Black community right now that have to be created or rebuilt, literally. And the Black family is at the key of this. It's at the center of this. So this is key. And what's different about this historical period that some of us didn't appreciate, and some of us did, and I do want to say this, the masses of Black people demonstrated that they're the only group that has coherence in basically understanding what they're facing. 87% of Blacks voted the right way in this election. 54% of Latinos, males, went for Trump. 61% of Latino women went for Harris. So there was a split. And with whites, there's a split. We often miss this. A majority of whites voted for Trump, but 40% of white women voted for Harris, and 35% of white men. And that's all you need, because power, in this case, when it comes to electoral politics, is based on coalitions. And so the question is, how do you pull together these different groupings? And so the numbers were on Harris's side, and the numbers, if the Democratic Party decides to change its ways, are on their side. But if they don't, they're in a world of trouble. But whether they do or not, we have to tend to our own reality. And it's building power and rebuilding it in our communities. And that also means building consciousness. So people who think that sharing information is just talk, they don't understand that if you don't have the right thought, you're not going to have the right walk. And so these two are really key. And while Blacks demonstrated still some integrity, we can see there's been a chipping away at some of our consciousness. Some of our people are not demonstrating common sense. They're a minority, but that minority could grow if we don't deal with it. As one brother at the Y, who's blind now, who used to be engaged in street life, said, today common sense ain't so common. And with the media doing what it's doing, some of us have been maneuvered into going against our own best interests. And there are a variety of reasons for this. I've covered some of this before. But by and large, the masses of Black people demonstrated that we still know who our enemy is. We got a race-conscious culture, and we do know a serious threat to us. The majority of us do, but some of us are confused, and then some of us have allowed their individual interests to take precedence over the collective interests of our people. So this historical crisis provides an opportunity for us to address what we're facing. So today I'm going to address the key component of the MAGA forces, those who lead it, and this corporate-based society at large, be referring to specifically the tech industrial complex and the other titans that run this country that are really behind Project 2025. And it should be clear to anyone that's not blind that the picks that Trump has made for his cabinet, and he's been making these picks before he's even installed in office, Those picks, some of them know what they're doing. Others are hardliners who basically will do what they're told and basically are taking an oppositional position to whatever agency they're heading. And so for the grassroots, that is the MAGA base, this looks like some kind of takeover of what Trump has called the deep state. Confused radicals might even think, oh, they're talking about this guy who's been put in charge of the FBI talking about smashing the FBI. And I know many radicals, even some progressives, would agree with that. Do you really believe that they're out to smash the FBI? The system for the state vamping on you? You got to be crazy. They're more interested in redirecting it in ways that are not going to be good for you. But Trump has pictured this thing, and he ran his campaign on his program. And so what he's getting ready to do, he's already got a base over 74 million that are behind him and think that what he's going to do is going to help them. And they're going to be unpleasantly surprised as this agenda gets unloaded. But this is a period that's different. This is a continuation of the second post-Reconstruction. But what makes this different from the first post-Reconstruction? Jim Crow in the South, which you could also call fascism towards Black people, was restricted to Blacks. And while we faced hell in the North, we could at least vote and do a few other things. But the point is, what you're faced with today is a move by Trump and those around him to disaggregate the structure of a Republican government. And see, the Democrats pose this as a threat to democracy. This is not a democracy. Democracy is where people rule. This is a republic. And a republic is where people have the right to vote, and they vote representatives, and then the representatives make their decisions. And the way this republic works, and most republic works, the two parties don't offer enough of a difference in most cases for those who run the country to be worried about any agenda that will upset the status quo. But there are exceptions when you have political office holders who make moves that are threatening to the status quo. And the biggest one was Roosevelt. And the biggest thing that Roosevelt did was put a 90% tax on the rich to finance his New Deal programs. That was something that the rich hated, and they hated the New Deal programs because though they had brought on the greatest depression the country had ever seen, that people were in the streets and hungry, they didn't really care, you know? And so what you're seeing with MAGA is an attempt to reverse those things that was done by what would normally be a Tweedledee, Tweedledum administration that gave people Social Security, that protected their bank accounts, that did a host of things and mainly provided jobs for people to pick them up. And then World War II took this country right out of what had been a depression. But the point is, since Reagan, the move has been to reverse all those gains. And while Biden was terrible on foreign policy, his war in Ukraine that should have never happened, and he is the one that pushed it to happen, and the genocide against the Palestinian people of, not 50 million, but probably close to 200,000 Palestinians are buried under the rubble. That was on his watch. He let it happen. But what he did domestically was an attempt to put America back in the game so they could compete with China by reindustrializing the country, by remodernizing it, by rebuilding roads and bridges and all this kind of stuff, and by taking back what this country had, which was nearly 40% of the chip industry, which this country innovated. You can't build anything now without chips, semiconductors. And so this presidency was an exception domestically because it meant that in the attempt to reshape the country, because Biden had two big objectives. One was to rebuild it so it could compete with China, and two was to win back the white working class, which is going to be tough because Trump's got them. What he got was labor leaders, you know. He didn't get the white working class. And I think if it comes back to the Democrats, it'll only be because they reshaped their program to address the needs of everyday people, which would mean continuing what Biden's done on a bigger scale. So if that doesn't happen, then you're going to have a problem. The only other reason why MAGA is likely to split is when Trump starts doing in the few gains they have left. And so we'll see how that one plays out. So the difference between the second post-Reconstruction and the first is it was fascism in the South. Now it's an attempt to create real fascism across the country. And as we will see soon, to also install it around the world. And I'll conclude on that one, you know. So my topic for today is the tech industrial complex's role in Project 2025. Basically, the purpose of this show is to identify the forces that are leading this move to reshape the country. And if you go back, the people who haven't been watching the show, most of you that are here now have, you'll see that we covered a lot of what Project 2025 is, but there's much more because that's a huge book on Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation. But I really want to say this, what they intend to do ain't all in a book. And the real uncertain thing is what Trump's going to do. And those around him who are advising him, the last one to get in and put something in his ear. And those things are not predictable because Trump doesn't even know what they are, you know? So what I want to do is focus on the forces that run this country, and particularly the forces who are heavily involved in the takeover right now of the government in reshaping it. One that some people said, oh, they won't possibly do this. Really? As one of our brilliant sisters said, when somebody tells you something, believe it. And I'll say this too. Usually with most people or most things, it's what is rarely said. But in this case, because you got a propagandist in chief, he's been saying it all over the place. And if people say they don't believe him, well, hell, you got to wait till somebody shoots you and they tell you they're going to shoot you to prove that it's going to happen. So what I want to do is start this off with two clips from Biden, his closing address to the nation, and two key things that he had to say there. And then I also want to include a clip from Eisenhower on his closing remarks. And it's interesting that both of these presidents has something to say at the end of their administration. I want to say that these two comments are historical because they're the only two presidents that have made these comments. I'm a historian. I know. You should know too. You know, and I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a supporter of Biden. So don't take it like that. I'm simply saying that what he had to say made some sense. And I told you, when I went through an awakening, it wasn't just my people that woke me up, it was my enemy. In fact, it was the awareness that I didn't know my enemy. And I'm saying some of us seem to be in worse shape than I was in. Because anybody black who bought that line that came from the internet that said neither the Democrats or the Republicans have done anything for you, which is generally true except for exceptions, one of which is Biden. But then for them to conclude, and some of them nationalists, now most of them didn't vote this way, but I'm saying some, and just blacks, some said, I'm voting for Trump. That's like a Jew saying they're voting for Hitler. Huh? That defies belief. You hear me? So I want to start with what Biden had to say, two comments that he made in his closing address. And then I don't have time to go into this one. There was another follow-up interview on MSNBC Thursday night. I think O'Donnell, whatever his name is, that did a tail end on his warning. So I want to start here. Most people expected this address to be a summary of what he had achieved, which is substantial. He made reference to it, but he had something else to say. And this ties into the whole issue of who's leading this thing, who's leading the country, but who's leading this move to reshape this country.
That America's in a position to continue to succeed. That's why my farewell address tonight, I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. This is a dangerous and that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. The dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. We see the consequences all across America, and we've seen it before. More than a century ago, the American people stood up to the robber barons back then and busted the trusts. They didn't punish the wealthy. Just made the wealthy play by the rules everybody else had to. Workers want rights to earn their fair share. You know, they were dealt into the deal. It helped put us on a path to building the largest middle class, the most prosperous century any nation in the world has ever seen. We've got to do that again. In the last 4 years, that's exactly what we've done. People should be able to make as much as they can, but play by the same rules. Pay their fair share of taxes. So much is at stake. Right now, the existential threat of climate change has
Well, this one, I thought I had my tech person put this up, but the key point here that was missed is that on this piece, Biden said that what threatens this country is the rise of an oligarchy, and where great power has been vested in the hands of a few. This is the first point. And the other stuff he was talking about, that's something else, but we'll get into that later. And this is the second point.
American leadership in technology is an unparalleled source of innovation that can transform lives. We see the same dangers, the concentration of technology, power, and wealth. You know, his farewell address, President Eisenhower spoke of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. He warned us then about, and I quote, the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power, end of quote. 6 decades later, I'm equally concerned about the potential rise of a tech-industrial complex that could pose real dangers for our country as well. Americans are being buried under an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation, enabling the abuse of power. The free press is crumbling. Editors are disappearing. Social media is giving up on fact-checking. The truth is smothered by lies told for power and for profit. We must hold the social platforms accountable to protect our children, our families, and our very democracy from the abuse of power. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence.
Okay, here he's referring to the tech industrial complex. And I'm going to get into this in a minute. And I see Jesse Paris, what have they done that is tangible? 5% unemployment rate, the increase of hundreds of thousands of jobs, and 16 million that will be coming down the line. When you do planning, it doesn't all show up all at once. That would be kind of like asking, when the civil rights and voting rights legislation was passed, what significance is that? You know what I mean? It's the Democrats' fault that they didn't publicize this thing. And a lot of it is not tangible yet because the shovels are just going in the ground. But the point is, this is the greatest shift in terms of the economy since the New Deal. And that's what's happened. And you don't know what it is. And the conscious blacks should have known on their own. They don't need the Democratic Party to tell you what they're doing. So Sleepy Joe wasn't all that sleepy. The one that was sleepy and not knowing what he was doing and got 300,000 people killed through COVID, he's the one coming back. And his eyes might be open, but there ain't too much coming out that's going to be benefiting you and me. So I just want to end this closing one, and then this is Eisenhower, and then get into what this means.
Or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Okay, I'll respond to some comments people are making here later. So there's only 2 times in the history of the United States that a president or presidents have warned about the concentration of power and specific concentration of power during their particular presidency. So Biden and Eisenhower made these comments at the end of their presidencies. Why was it at the end of their presidencies? Because as long as they were in office, they were not going to just, hit the nail on the head and identify the major problem, because their party was also dependent upon some of these forces that they're identifying. The Democrats, for example, the complexes that Biden identified, the techno-industrial complex, which I'll get into in a minute, which is Silicon Valley, that has been a bastion until this election of the Democratic Party, and still they get their major support from there. So as long as he's in office, he ain't going to come down and just identify them as the problem. But that's what his $1.9 trillion infrastructure bill was designed to do. And by the way, it targeted blacks. Your unemployment rate is 5%. It ain't been at that level for 15 or 20 years. That's because it was targeted. There's all other kinds of things that were targeted. Targeted Native Americans. Native American reservations got billions of dollars coming out of this. And Native Americans are always left out, and they are the base of this country through genocide. But the key point is that they both end up making this address at the end of their terms. Eisenhower, a 5-star general, is identifying the very system that provided the arms for the American war effort in World War II, and the arms that supported Russia, though Russia did most of their own arms manufacturing, and the arms that sustained Britain, And this is a 5-star general telling you there's a real problem when the country's economy is mainly focused on the military industrial complex. He's saying that a good part of the jobs in this country are coming from there. And if you check out a lot of blacks, their livelihood, a lot of them are in the military to this day because they can't find a good civilian job, So these 2 presidents make these warnings at the end of their presidency because they no longer have anything to lose. But in the case of Biden, he was providing an alternative to this system, contrary to the Sleepy Joe image. He did more in 1 year than most presidents do in 2. And if you don't see it, you need to go look at it. And a 5% unemployment rate is tangible, because it's normally 10 to 12% or higher. That's tangible. So first, in looking at these clips, so Biden is warning of an oligarchy that is forming. It is actually formed and is being increased. And with Project 2025 is going to increase greatly if it's not stopped. And so we need to first ask ourselves, what do you mean when you use the term oligarchy? The term oligarchy refers to a government ruled by a few. And while you might say, well, yeah, the corporations have run everything anyway. No, this is referring to a system where the people are really shut out and only a few people are making the decisions, period. blacks made some decisions in 2020 in South Carolina that gave Biden the nod to be nominated, and then put him in the position where he felt he had to pick someone black as his vice president and picked a black woman. That came from your power, and it came from South Carolina, where black people have some real sense. Please believe me, that's where you have one of the greatest concentrations of African culture. And then what ends up happening is when he comes into office, he decides to shift to the left. That's why Bernie Sanders supported him. That's why AOC, Miss Cortez, and the others, the radicals in Congress, supported him, because he made a decision that he was going to go big. And he was going to go big in areas that would actually benefit people. And if you're going to argue, and I spelled out before what that was, infrastructure. Those are jobs that pay good. Industrial jobs, supporting unions. This is the president that supported unions, while Biden's people, Trump's people, are talking about they don't want to increase the federal minimum wage is a little over $7 an hour. $7 an hour, huh? So support for unions, But the main thing is this was proportionally targeted for blacks as well as small business, which, by the way, Harris, she put her ideas into that. So if you want to talk against that, then you're talking against common sense. And then that means that you may have trouble identifying good strategies for rebuilding your communities. Because I'm going to tell you, the main ones are economic. I'm the only nationalist, Pan-Africanist that's good at economic development. Most nationalists are broke. I think broke ain't a joke. I think broke is misery. And this is a colonial, semi-colonial system designed to keep you in misery. And so rebuilding black communities is going to be heavily economic. You hear me? Heavily for poor people. So the point is that in warning of the rise of an oligarchy, the rise of a few, Biden is referring to the fact that these few are now getting into the government, not elected, and they're going to be making some decisions that you had no say-so in them doing at all. And Elon Musk is at the head of it, but there are many more that are coming in as well from the techno-industrial complex, Silicon Valley, and from others. So when he refers to the high-tech or techno-industrial complex, he's referring to the billionaires that run Silicon Valley, that contain the richest people in the world. Now, China right now is catching up to the US. They're still behind, but they're catching up. And one of the things the Chinese are doing is they're investing in education, and specifically the education of engineers, scientists, high-tech people. They produce more engineers, more scientists, more high-tech people than all of the graduates of universities and colleges in the United States, all of them, every year. And by the way, the head of China is himself an engineer, just as the founder of Kemet was a hydraulic engineer, an engineer that dealt with water. In other words, the leadership is based on building. But what the Chinese lack is Silicon Valley. They don't have a Silicon Valley. They don't have the kind of innovation that's coming from there. And it's some of these that have decided to support Trump, either to protect themselves, as Zuckerberg has done by ending fact-checking, which is one of the things that Biden was referring to when he talked about the rise of an oligarchy, that fact-checking is being eliminated, that led one of your titans, the head of Amazon, who owns the Washington Post, who owns the Washington Post, to stop their editorial people from endorsing Harris, which and he's not been a Trump supporter before, but now he's trying to kiss up to Trump, because basically what he wanted to do was to protect himself with a emerging Trump administration. So when Biden's referring to the fact that there's yeah, thank you. I got it. Take it out, Senator. Yeah, thank you. When Biden is referring to the fact that there is the emergence of an oligarchy, and he's giving as examples the decline in press freedom and stuff, we know that corporations generally own the press. So the press ain't free as it is. There's a corporate media. And what's happening with Trump is they're talking about ending any kind of funding to media such as PBS or anything else that provides a slightly left of center view. You know, they're talking about ending that. And they're talking about ending nonprofit status to organizations that, you know, will be opposing them. They're not going to end nonprofit status for churches in the right wing that make up the MAGA base. It's a question, how many of Silicon Valley jobs are going to our people? Very, very few. And that's also part of our task, not just for Silicon Valley, but we have to upgrade the skills of our people so that more of them, particularly young people, have high-tech skills. I had on this show a former student of mine who's a high-tech specialist. And what he's done in the Hunters Point is train young blacks, mainly young black males, in computer technology. He at one point was working for $1 billion computer firm that services these Silicon Valley corporations. And he was on the show talking about his coffee shop because he's setting up a chain of coffee shops in the black community. So one of the things we have to do is train our people in these skills and set up our own tech companies, as well as get to work in them. And one thing about tech jobs is it's kind of like construction work. If you haven't done rape or murder, even if you have a criminal record, you can usually get a job in that. So yeah, it's, Silicon Valley ain't providing too many to our people, but you better understand that upgrading our skills is an essential thing in rebuilding black communities. In this case, economic skills. So, so this dangerous concentration of power, Biden has identified as a concentration of wealth in the techno-industrial complex. So it's the few people coming out of there that he's identifying as a major problem that threatens democracy. Now, as I pointed out before, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been open to any kind of Silicon Valley support they could get. And until this election, the Democrats had a lock on it. And part of the reason the Democratic Party is in trouble is that with Clinton, they favored the tech sector over the working class. Now, the working class was already moving away from the Democratic Party. The Southern white working class, as soon as the voting rights and civil rights bills were passed, they began to move Republican. And of course, now the Republican Party is a white party. And Clinton makes a decision to mainstream the Democratic Party further than it was already maintained on, mainstream under what he called New Democrats, who behave more like Republicans. Robin says he got confidence in our young people being successful in the tech industry. Yeah. Blacks are good at programming because we're creative. What we bring into the tech sector is creating programs. I taught for 40 years in university, and I had a number of students who were tech majors. And that's what they all said, but I knew it anyway. If you know our culture, you'll know that. We're creative. We're the most creative people on the planet. So we tend to go in and create systems. And so with the right training and encouragement, you can set up your own tech sectors, and should. So when Biden is talking about a dangerous concentration of power in an oligarchy of wealth, and then identifies the tech industrial complex, he's making an important point. But I'm going to add to it because it's a lot more than the tech industrial complex that represents the problem, that is the head of what's going on right now and runs a society. And I'll get back into that in a minute. When Eisenhower warned of a military industrial complex, he's referring to the arms industry and how the arms industry took over the economy after the end of World War II. There are very few people that give you this analysis. I've given it to some of you before. Some of you, it's new. When Truman comes into office, Truman is faced with a problem. He has no support in the Democratic Party. Now, if you want to talk about somebody who was sleepy, it was him. He slept through cabinet meetings when he became president. This was a know-nothing person, but he had a consequential presidency. He changed things on so many different levels. It's funny. And the biggest change was the decision to put America in the position of building up a military industrial complex. Now, they had manufactured a lot of weapons for World War II. But when the war is over, the United States is in the position where it's the only European in that, the dominant population of this country is European nation that had not been bombed to the ground. And it was the only one with its economy intact, and it was the strongest economy in the world. When Truman comes in, he had an option. He could build up a peacetime economy. He could take that economic power and shift it from guns to butter. He could do what Biden's doing now, rebuilding the infrastructure. Now, the one thing Eisenhower did was build a highway system. Because as a military man, he traveled across the country when he was in the military and observed that there was not a highway system. So he built a highway system. That's what he did. That was about all he did. And he was deaf, dumb, and blind to civil rights and everything else, and really allowed the plantocracy in the South to do their bidding. But that's the one thing he did. But the point is, Truman was in trouble because the most popular person in the Democratic Party was a guy named Wallace. Wallace was the most progressive person that has held a vice presidency and could hold the presidency in U.S. history. He was not a racist. He had all kinds of ideas for the poor. He was himself trained in agronomy. His father and him went to the same university that George Washington Carver went to. He was a friend of George Washington Carver, but his father was really close to him. And so the problem that Truman had was that if he didn't reshape the face of the Democratic Party, he was not going to get reelected. And Wallace had the popular support. It would be hard for Wallace to win because the party leaders would go against him, but he had the mass support. And so what did he do? And see, he wasn't smart enough to come up with this on his own. This is a guy with a high school education. By the way, high school don't make you dumb. And if you're a reader, you don't have to have a college education. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was trained through an apprenticeship system. He did reading on his own. You know what I mean? But if you don't read, you can't lead. Some of you questioning, what do you get from what Biden's done? You haven't done the reading. Go do the reading. Go check out the program. And then come back and tell me it doesn't have any application to you. And so, as Ogawa says, Henry Wallace, so Wallace posed a problem. So what Truman, but he didn't come up with this on his own. And see, the historians that write about Truman, they have rebuilt his image. Anyone that serves the people in power, they get a good write-up. Even though when he left office, it wasn't good later, he's been rehabilitated, so he's listed as a great president, I know that the arms industry and the senators that represented the arms industry got to Truman. And they told him, you need to keep this military-industrial system going. And one of the arguments they had was that if you don't, you might have another depression. But the real reason was they wanted to continue to prime the budget, the pump of the budget. Right now, over $1 trillion goes to the defense budget, and there's nothing left for hardly anything else. Social Security is listed as an entitlement when it's your program. That is also designed to make it look like the government's spending a lot on social programs when it's your money. The government doesn't put money into Social Security. It comes out of your pocket. And that's why it's set up to be cut. Because they can argue that this is an entitlement. Well, cut it and see what happens. It's going to be hell breaking loose. So the point is, he then has to create a reason for building a military-industrial complex. By the way, you don't get this in any book. I study American history, by the way, not just African history. I study European history, I study Chinese, and I study Mexican history. Why do I do that? We live in the world. My first study is us. But I study them, and I study sources I nobody looked at. They're the sources that are not out there. If you go to university, you're not going to get trained from these sources. I retrained myself after I realized I was brainwashed. That's why I'm writing a book on subject. It's a whole new system for education. And that's what we have to do, is look at long-term and short-term at the same time. So when you look at this move to create a military-industrial system where the budget is going to arms and to an army, how do you do that? You have to have an enemy. So Russia was created as the enemy. And Truman was advised that if you want to get this through Congress, you're going to have to scare the American people. So he created the myth that the Russians are a threat to national security. Now, the same question that you have of how could somebody get into office with 34 felonies, convicted of them, molesting, and everything else, and then a tissue of lies. Well, the system's based on a tissue of lies. And so this was a big lie that you could only sell to the American people. You could not sell this to the Europeans. And the lie was the Russians are a threat to world security. And the Russians got the atom bomb shortly after America, because their spies were all over the atom bomb project. They have one of the best spycraft systems in the world, the Russians do. The British, the French, even the Germans couldn't be persuaded that the Russians were a threat to European order, because the Russians saved the Europeans from Germany. Hitler lost most of his divisions in Russia, over 200. The Americans and the British, and what was they called the Free French, which was hardly any, their little invasion in 1944 occurs after the Russians had really won World War II. So how is it that the people that save you from the Nazis, how do they suddenly become the enemy? The way that happened is they got both parties to agree to this. In other words, Truman needed to save his behind, because if he's leading what he calls a Cold War, who ever heard of a Cold War? That means it's no war. He never wanted to go to war with, Russia, because Russia had the atom bomb. This country ain't going to war with nobody that's got the bomb. Huh? So the only way the American people could be brainwashed to this is, of course, one, they have a short memory. This country doesn't have a long memory to begin with. Most of their history is mythological. You know what I mean? The past for them is yesterday. The Chinese is 3,000 years ago. Me, it's 149,000 years ago. That's why I'm so healthy. And I'm a good strategist. Why? I have a long view and then a very practical one of the battlefield and how to take you apart right there. And even though you're stronger, beat you. So in the case of Truman's able to create this myth because the Russians, Dewey, goes along with this. And Dewey would become the major contender against Truman when he ran for election. And that put him in a bind. Had Roosevelt lived, there would have been an alliance between Russia and the United States. He had already laid it out. Russia had agreed to the formation of the United Nations. Russia had agreed to what Roosevelt wanted, which was to cool the Chinese out by supporting mainly the Kuomintang, the Russians, even though they came in and also had advisors, the Chinese Communist Party. He cooled out the communists in Greece. He cooled out the Communist Party in France. That's what he did to, curry favor with Roosevelt. And he was promised that they would get money to rebuild Russia. But when nothing Truman comes in, he comes up with this, the Russians are coming. On the corner of where I live, on the corner of the street, a Chinese American built a huge house, and he has a bomb shelter in it. Because he actually believed that the Russians were going to lob atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs on the US. Crazy. Hell no. You know what I mean? So the point is, when Eisenhower is talking about the military-industrial complex, which he earned his living through prior to becoming president, he's referring to the system of arming the country where they kept the draft when there was no enemy in sight and kept a standing army, and then, constantly building weapons. And then when the Democrats get in office, they start to engage in war, starting with Truman and his war in Korea. That was the first defeat America's faced. So the point I'm making here about oligarchs and the few who run things, well, the people who are really running things there was the munitions industry, the arms industry. And Truman was dancing to it, the Republicans and the Democrats. And if you build arms, what are you going to do? You're going to go to war. And so what's brought this country down is not only a lack of grand strategy, but the decision of the occupants of the White House. Stevenson, who didn't occupy the White House, lays the line down. You, again, don't get this in any history book. Stevenson, who ran against Eisenhower and lost later, Stevenson said that the U.S. should intervene in the third world and engage in military struggle. Eisenhower's position was, let the Asians fight the Asians. And for 8 years, after having a truce, there's never been a peace in Korea. And I want to stress again, America's first defeat was in North Korea when Mao ran the Marine Corps and the Army across the 38th parallel because they had crossed in the 38th parallel. They're going into China. He had warned them. And in my brainwashed days when I was in the Marines, they called this a strategic withdrawal. As I've said before, if you're out on the street and you got a little group and they're going up against another group and your group runs, that means you got your butt whipped. Now, sometimes it's smart to run to avoid getting your butt whipped. But in this case, it was a bloody run. You hear me? So the point is, America is now in decline because these captains of the arms industry have really shaped, along with the military complex, which is the generals and everything else, but they don't make the decision. It's the political leaders that make the decisions. And so you're seeing America in decline because of defeat in North Korea, defeat in Vietnam, defeat in Iraq, defeat in Afghanistan. And it's crumbling because instead of putting the resources into building up the country, they put it into the pockets of the rich conglomerates to control the military. So when we're talking about oligarchs, the oligarchs of the arms industry are key when, we talk about this complex. Now, while Biden's address is prescient in that he is telling you something that's important, and you want to call him sleepy, I say he was quite awake on this. And if you don't get this, you're really not getting much of anything. Yeah, as Jesse Paris says, the spending is about $1 trillion, which I said earlier. Yeah, that's correct on the military. So Biden identifies an oligarch, a small group that is amassing power, and then he focuses on Silicon Valley. Actually, the oligarchs have to go further than that, but Silicon Valley is playing a leading role because that's the technology that is driving not only this economy, but global economies, or puts other economies in the garbage can because they don't have this technology. But there's more to oligarchs than just the oligarchs coming from Silicon Valley, the techno-industrial complex. There's more to it than that. Basically, the oligarchs that run this country are those that come from the corporate elite in general, the arms industry as one part of it, but that corporate elite includes the investor class. And when Biden talks about a techno-industrial class, right alongside that should be a techno-industrial investor class, because it's these people in the hedge funds and banks that put this country into a deep nosedive with the collapse of the economy in 2008. And they are the ones that make the major decisions coming out of corporations to take the jobs out of the country, that basically does in the standard of living of blacks and collapses black families heavily and erodes white families and other families of color, particularly brown, but brown has stood up a little better, but they've been hurt. But we've been hurt more because we were concentrated in those jobs, blacks, that were sent overseas. 20% of the industrial workers were black when we're 12% of the country. So the oligarchs aren't just the techno-industrial class. The oligarchs are corporate leaders, the arms industry in particular. And when Eisenhower warned the country of a military-industrial complex, most people don't know this. He wanted to say the military-industrial political class. He left political out because his advisors said it would offend too many people, meaning it would offend his party and the Democratic Party, that makes it possible for legislation to be passed every year to keep this military industrial complex going. And so the political elite plays a major part in this, and that elite grows out of a British parliamentary system where the party systems are not set up to represent the people. They are set up to basically represent the interests of those who control the wealth in the society. So while Biden's warning of a techno-industrial complex, it's much more than that. And as I've already said, he's not mentioning the fact that the Democrats have benefited most from this techno-industrial complex when it comes to campaign contributions and everything else. And in fact, Harris had more of this support than Biden had, not just because she is of African and Indian background, but because she mined that field when she was district attorney and when she was attorney general, because she's living in the Bay Area. And her relationship with Willie Brown gave her access to these power centers. I look at power, and I've known exactly what she represented. But the fact is, she represented a chance to beat these guys who want to shut down any say-so that you're going to have in any politics in this country. And so you always try and win the best way. You can't win that way, you're going to have to win another. So oligarchy is key to the running of this country. Behind major decisions, they're there. They're pulling the strings. Now, oligarchy isn't new in the US, ruled by a few, even when you have Republican government, them having major control. What's new here is that a section of the oligarchy, in this case, the techno-industrial class and some others, have made the decision to join this administration so that they can get their goodies, government contracts and many other things, and they can be protected from the wrath of Donald Trump. And they're doing it at the expense of Republican institutions. You could well have the ending of voting before these 4 years are finished if you're not careful. I was talking to Dr. Raymond Winbush, and most people know this. They've done studies on the life of republics, and they've 150 years is about the limit, and we're well past that. So when you have a base of people who are calling for this and get violent if you go against them, witness January the 6th, that Trump is getting ready to give pardons to all of them for, then you've got a strong argument. And so the corporate elite will look at that and say, well, if that's the way it's going, maybe we'll go with this, because they've been basically more opposed to Trump until the results of this election than to the Democrats. So this is the real issue that we're facing right now. So things that you can predict right now, and it's basically going to be see how this plays out. You can predict that mass deportations are going to be moved on. And when they say 10 million or more, if you think they're kidding, you need to take another look at it. Miller, who is as right-wing as you get, who's a right-wing Jew, is really in charge of orchestrating this. Trump has put people in positions that know what they're doing, that are imbued with hate, and will push it. So it's predictable this move will be made. How it goes, it remains to be seen. What kind of resistance takes place and everything else. Second, you can be sure that the cuts that Elon Musk and his assistant are going to recommend, and that Trump and others in his administration will also be pushing for, and that Project 2025 has already identified, is going to definitely cut into social programs that benefit the poor. This move to eliminate the Department of Education, they're serious about that. I was talking to Raymond Winbush because I hadn't seen this. He makes the point that a good part of the financial support to Black colleges comes from the Department of Education. Cut it out, and you're going to see a good part of their funding go, which means some of those institutions could collapse. And then the Department of Education was set up by Jimmy Carter. And one of the things about it is to carry out enforcement provisions against discrimination, against racism. They don't do a good job. It's better than nothing. And the point is, they're talking about then taking the money that would go to the Department of Education and send it directly to the states. That's states' rights. Had the states had the final decision on slavery, we would still be in slavery. Had the Supreme Court had the final decision, we'd still be in slavery. You hear what I'm saying? So the move on the Department of Education from the American standpoint, and see, I'm not pushing American interests, I push African interests, you know? But from their standpoint, that is about as dumb as you can get. Slavery made it illegal for Blacks to learn. Now, the right wing, they seem to want to make it illegal to learn. They've already priced them out with colleges costing so much. But when you're competing in a world in which survival is dependent upon skills, and you are going to take out the one institution that is supposed to be developing skills, you are in a world of trouble. But this has been a Republican agenda forever. And so if this happens, it's going to have terrible consequences. And then, as I've already said, it's clear, one, what I haven't said, it's clear they're going to do this big tax cut. They're going to extend the one and probably enlarge it. Most of that will go to the rich. Then they're going to use the cost of that, trillions of dollars, to call for cuts. And that will clearly be Social Security and Medicare. See, the worst part of this is by the end of this term, 4 years, if they're allowed to do what they do, Social Security could be totally eliminated because it's a huge budget that has come from the savings of everyday people in this country. Most people who are retired now only have Social Security. So if you want to talk about homelessness, then wait and see what happens if that happens. So it's going to depend on what measures are taken to oppose this. And it's also a question for them of how do they get through some very unpopular things through Congress when many of them are going to require 60 votes in the Senate. And the Republicans don't have the 60 votes. And right now they're talking about one big bill to stuff a lot of things in it and try and get past the 60 vote number. So we'll see. But this is going to be the context in which we have to organize. Now, I just want to briefly summarize some things about oligarchy and how central that concept is for European culture. They're not the only ones that had oligarchy, but their cultures are driven by it. I've covered before the Aryan Lord and Master syndrome, which is the culture that first forms coming out of Ukraine, Russia, and the Caucasus Mountains, where the system develops of warfare through nomadism based on patriarchy. And so what you see is the grabbing of power. This is at the foundation of European family and political and economic systems that would develop later. These warlike people are not depending upon any say-so coming from the group. And it's based on the strong ruling everyone else. Capitalism would have deep in its past this origin. It's not that they were capitalists. It's that the ethos and philosophy of nomadism, which is a few waging power, the Arius, lords and masters, over the Aryans, the masses, in this case of whites, and then Arius and Aryans uniting against the people they conquer, which isn't in Africa first, by the way. When you look at the development of systems in Europe, it's important to look at the philosophies that drive oligarchy, or a few people ruling. And a key philosopher that's key, but that philosopher is just somebody who gave voice to the deep-seated beliefs of the people, in this case, the Greek people. And this man, his name, I've referred to him before briefly, is Hesiod. Hesiod is the first philosopher of the Aryans. And I'm saying this in the book I'm finishing now. Africans in this country and in most of the world do not know Aryan or European culture. A few do, and those that do, too often, it's through their training in European institutions, and they don't see it through African eyes, but a few do, but most don't. We center our analysis purely on white supremacy, and we think that's it. Well, Hesiod comes before white supremacy, before there's any idea that whites had an entitlement to rule the world. But he had many ideas. You can read the book. When the book comes out, it'll be out this year on Seba and Sodiah. The key thing is on arbitrary power or arbitrary freedom. And this is at the root of European conceptions of power and freedom. To put it simply, it means that those who have the power do whatever they want to do. In this sense, Trump is an Aryan man. So are the others as well. Corporate elite are made up of psychotic people who basically make decisions that kill off people all over the planet. And because they make the laws, they don't suffer the consequences. And you're seeing the wildfires going on right now. You've seen the flooding and everything else. This is the arbitrary power that Europeans have exercised over nature, not just human beings. And the Greeks, that was what really drove them. Kemetic influence was secondary. The Greek worldview was primary. And so this idea of arbitrary power and arbitrary freedom is at the core of how European systems work. There's much more to this. I'm just being real brief here. But when we talk about the elite, the oligarchy that's running things now, then you can trace this directly back on an economic level to the Dutch East Indian Company, formed March 20th, 1602. The Dutch East India Company. And this was a company that sold stock to the Dutch people in the trade of slaves. This is the origin of capitalism, the Dutch East India Company. And they had themselves a stock market. And that was a place where you traded in stocks on slaves. That same system was picked up by Britain December 31st, 1602, just a few months later, and they become the masters of it. Marx, when he studied capitalism, and I've read Marx, and I think he's got some good points. Basically, his best point is capitalism is no good, it's exploitative. And he does a thing on how wealth is accumulated under capitalism by big business or the wealthy. And it's a thing called the difference between use value and exchange value. In other words, he analyzes how commodities are created, and we were considered a commodity, property. And he's showing how wealth was drained out of the working class in Europe by the labor they put into a product. And part of that is the use value. But when it came to selling the product was sold for much more than the worker got in exchange. This is just a brief summary of this theory, and it's correct. And so if you look at the United States, the bleeding not only of the slave, but of the working class was a key to the accumulation of the wealth of the people in this country. But the key point is slavery was the basis for the creation of capitalism. You not only have the East Indian companies of the Dutch and the English, but you have the stock market, which is the basis for exchanging the instruments of profit. Marx didn't study this. Huh? You often hear me say, I'm not anti-Marxist, but I'm not a Marxist. There's a lot of reasons for that. But the key point is, when you want to talk about oligarchy, the oligarchy that forms, that is the basis in this country, in Europe, throughout the world, is that it is an oligarchy that is rooted in the wealth that they extracted from us. If you're going to defeat an enemy, you better understand where this stuff is coming from. And in this case, it comes from you. And so you got a reparations movement that's saying, I want to be paid for what I did. And you're right. The problem with that is you ain't getting that until you have the power to force them to do it, because they're not going to do it based on conscience. They don't have any conscience. Their love is power. Their love is oppression. So when we look at the two East India companies, these companies are then the basis for the accumulation of power that leads to what becomes the industrial system of Britain and the United States. It comes out of the slave trade. It comes out of, and in this country, out of the genocide of Native Americans. And throughout the world, wherever colonialism was implanted, genocide also followed. We often are taught that colonialism was just them going and occupying countries. Well, when the Australians went into Australia, they wiped out the Aborigines, almost all of them. And that happened in many parts of the world. And they did that to Native Americans in the Caribbean, in Mesoamerica. They didn't wipe out all those in Mesoamerica, but they wiped out a substantial number. Christopher Columbus's enterprise wasn't just an enterprise of discovery, it was an enterprise of extermination. So what's called the techno-industrial complex, the political complex, the corporate complex, the military-industrial complex, they all stand on this foundation. Now, here's the key point. As we rebuild families and communities, and as we rebuild nations, we're going to have to start looking long-term at a view of a society that will offer justice, that will offer prosperity, that will offer dignity and power to our people. And that comes out of our own historical roots. Communalism, or the idea of the land, air, and water, was the economic system of Africa. It was the economic system of Native America. It was the economic system of much of the ancient world prior to nomadic and then other invasions. And so when we're looking at rebuilding Black communities, we need to be looking at cooperative economics and how do we pool wealth in a way that can be shared by the many. That doesn't mean that we oppose blacks who have their own businesses, because we need to support those. But the greatest good is going to come to people who have the greatest share in something, and they have a say-so in it as well. So while we're rebuilding families and communities and nations, and while we're facing the attempt to install fascism, we have to understand that we have a culture that gave birth to democracy. I've covered this in many shows over this last 4 years. If you didn't get that, then you missed the whole point. And I call this a twin lineal system. And that's going to be a model for rebuilding Black families. It's going to take the cooperation of males and females. And contrary to popular opinion, we've got a lot of good families. They haven't heard this word twin lineal, but if you've got a functioning African or African American, African Caribbean, African diasporan family, there's cooperation between males and females. That's what really makes it work. And there's no one formula, but there's got to be a balance between the two. So we have to have a long-term view, which helps us right now in terms of rebuilding families, communities, and nations. And right now, we have to take advantage of every mistake that is made by the people who are in power while we go about the business of rebuilding our families, communities, and nations. I want to say this also, what's happening here, it ain't just happening here. Elon Musk is making moves in Britain, initially to support Farage, who was the right-wing leader that supported Brexit, or the move of the British outside of the European Union. He just had some differences with Farage, so we'll see how long that lasts, but he's opposing the duly elected Labour government in the UK. He's supporting the right-wing government, not the right-wing government, the right-wing movement in Germany that seeks to replace the current government that has fallen. And he's talking about pumping a lot of money into them. And he supports the right-wing government in Italy. And he has been supportive of Bolsonaro. The problem is Bolsonaro is gone where Trump should have gone, to jail. He's facing charges now. That is a right-wing leader that ran Brazil until he was defeated by Lula, who is a populist, who's doing good things, has before and will now. So what you're seeing is, and Trump's brain, who managed his first campaign for president, Steve Bannon, had been doing this kind of organizing both in Trump's first term and when he was out of office. But what you have now is the richest person in the world pumping their money in to try and influence governments by supporting the most reactionary. And he did say that what you need is a few men to run America. He said that. And you know what he meant? A few white men. And that's what's happening now. And don't say the Indian who's supporting him isn't white. He ask him, he'll tell you he's an Aryan, mixed in color because they had to sleep with Black women after they conquered India, but their culture is Aryan of a particular variety, which most whites in this country won't accept, but that's a reality. So the topic for this show was the tech industrial complex's role in Project 2025. They're coming in to use their skills to profit. And the question is, what do you do to build your own power? And I'm going to say this. Those of you that don't belong to an organization, but you've got a lot of talk, you haven't got a walk. You need to get involved in something that is looking out for the well-being of Black people. And there's a part of that, these groupings have to come together to begin to shape strategy. I think that our youth have done a good job in the past period. Black Lives Matter demonstrated the maturity of the hip-hop generation. I'm not so sure that Black Lives Matter is going to be the instrument for this period and for this time. But it's the pressures of this time that require us to really get our acts together. So I hope you got something out of this. Building power, real Black power, is a task today, not a slogan like it was in the 60s, but real power. And some of us in the 60s built real power. Real power is nothing you play with. You got more than you think. And had enough of us had our eyes open and enough others who stood on the sideline, we wouldn't be faced with this. But since we are, we better get our act together. Hotep. Let's see if there's any comments here. Deborah Lamont, B.J. Phillips, this, my daughter's principal of her school called Pan-African Progressive Education. He was also one of my professors at San Francisco State. Yeah, that's our school, the school that Pan-African People's Organization runs. My former students and others, they run it. I set it up, but they've been running it. If it was left to me, it wouldn't be standing. So people like Dabiti Mtambuzi, Ustadi Kadiri, Robert Woods, who's been over 30 years teaching in that school, where 99% of our kids go to college with an African frame of mind and well-educated in math and science, not my strengths, as well as history and culture and language arts and everything else. And so that's one of the things we have to do now is rebuild institutions and quit going for the money. They come up with charter schools, and one of the biggest mistakes that independent Black schools made was to go for charter money, and those schools no longer exist. Charters were set up to basically siphon off public school dollars to put in the pockets of rich whites. And any Blacks who fall for it, they don't know what it's really for. Kids don't learn anymore in charter schools and public schools, and they can learn more when we take them over. I gave you an example. I brought you the example of the W.B. Du Bois Learning Center and the movement to take over the schools in Kansas City, Missouri, carried out by the Black United Front chapter of Kansas City. And I had some people talking about, no, this isn't it. Really? Huh. They ran over 1,200 school system teaching 1,200 Black kids using the public school budget for 20 years. But we don't even know a victory when we see it. Some of us do. I mean, I know there's some people here that do, but a lot of us don't. So one of the things when we're rebuilding Black communities and Black families and Black nations, we need to look at the models that we already have. If you got a model that works, you don't go back to a Model T. No, you go to something high tech, and that's what works. We seem to like people who got buried in the grave. They become martyrs. Yeah, we should. And because a lot of them were buried in the grave, not because they made any mistakes, but because, and even if they did, because me, I'm not interested in being no martyr. You know what I mean? Huh? Are you crazy? You know what I mean? That's what your enemy wants. I'm not interested in having a day named after me. I'm interested in seeing my people in power. And I'm interested in wielding as much of it I have throughout my life. I've never lost a battle. But now it's going to be a lot of new ones stepping up to the plate. A lot of youngsters, they're going to have to roll up their sleeves. Some of them already are. They're in the battlefields in Black communities fighting against the police and other things. And they need support. They were in the battlefield out there in Georgia trying to win the election. And a lot of them are sisters, you know. They're doing wonderful work. Got to support them. But praising the Lord ain't enough. You got to pass something in the way of power. And that means you got to build some. So if you think these times are hard that you're facing now, our people have faced far harder times, except that these people, they're organized. And when you're out here talking dummy stuff about people aren't doing something that have done something, that's dumb. And I'm just going to tell you, it's dumb. You don't know what's going on right before your eyes. And for some of us to have fallen for this stuff, that amazes me because it never happened before. So, and by the way, people who want to make donations, you just go right to what's listed here on Cash App and clicking on not just the subscriber button, but donate to the Dr. Obitashaka Show Cash App, $ Pan-African Publishers. And I do want to thank the people who have done that before. Yeah, we have that. And in fact, people have been donating, and my wife just transferred money into the account. So don't be saying that we don't have one. You can go directly into that. But if you do PayPal or Zelle, then we'll have to work on that one. So let's see if there's anything to respond to here. You know, it's a lot of work doing these shows, and the reason you've had so many shows that have been replays is, one, we got a couple of hundred, and we got a lot of new viewers that haven't seen them, and two, I'm writing. And the writing takes first preference for me, because that's a legacy. And this book I'm doing now, it's really 30 years I've been working on it, you know, and it'll be out this year. Thanks, Robin, for your comments, and thanks for your dedication and your support. Feel like you're a part of the family here. Multi Leonard said they can make a one-time contribution of $120. That's appreciated. If you want to, you can go right through where it tells you to subscribe, and that's the easiest way to do that. Peggy Parks Miller. I'm ready to oppose these inhumane people who hate us without cause. Okay, good. Jesse Paris, Che Nkrumah. Oligarchy, from Greek, rule by few, is a form of government in which power rests with a small number. Yes, and I didn't go into how it worked in Greece, but it basically arose from the same conditions you have here, where very few people had all the wealth and the rest was struggling. And so it was a struggle against that. Milty Leonard, communists have declared Western powers as the enemy after the Russian Revolution. Yeah, but the Russians didn't have a revolution. They've called it a revolution. A coup d'etat, where one elite group takes the place of another, is not a revolution. And so when Stalin comes to power, he's killing more Russians probably than Hitler killed. That ain't no revolution, you know? There have only been two real revolutions in the 20th century, the Chinese Revolution and the Mexican Revolution. And I covered the Mexican Revolution in one of the programs that I did, because those were mass struggles. They did achieve certain things. Robin said, "That's right. Cut Social Security and will be held to pay." Yeah. Ogawa, who's an expert on all the shows here. The episode Bob is talking about is episode 61, published December 11, 2021, titled Moving from Jobless Black Communities to Black Economic Development. Yeah, check that out. Jesse Paris, Che and Nkrumah. He was going to be lame duck president. All he is going to remember for is not doing anything for us except incarcerating us. It's true. In Biden's role as a senator, he signed on to the incarceration acts. He signed on almost every war that this country has done, you know. And the wars that he contributed to under his own watch. But you don't know your homework, Jesse Paris, Che, and Nkrumah. Why do you think Bernie Sanders says? Why do you think I say? Why do you think a whole bunch of people say that he's already established the fact that he's the third best president this country's produced? And it's based on what he did. I gave you the stuff and you ain't responding to it. A $1.9 trillion infrastructure, CHIPS Act, environmental and reindustrialization program, matched by at least $3 trillion coming from the private sector. And this, you asked before, what did it do for us? It got you jobs, and some of them very good paying, and more of them will be good paying jobs. So you missed that. You're talking about what he did before. And a lot of you were listening to, who come up with this line, the propaganda that the Republicans did on the internet. But you're not looking at what actually happened. So, no, he's not going to be remembered as a lame duck president. He's going to be remembered for having pushed through programs third behind Roosevelt, with Johnson coming up next. Significant. And by the way, one of the reasons was because he's old. Guess what? If you got half a brain, you get wise. And contrary to this Sleepy Joe, he must have been doing something other than sleeping to put this kind of program through. You hear me? You don't even see it. 5% unemployment rate, that means cutting it in half. And by the way, that came through us leaning on him. That's how we got this. But since you don't think we have any power, those that took that position, that's what you think. Doraville. Kennedy warned of the repugnancy of the threat of the machinery that made up the intelligence agencies. Kennedy who? Are you talking about John Kennedy? I hope you're not talking about this guy they're getting ready to put in, if they put him in, Robert Kennedy Jr. Biden is one of the architects of it. That is correct. But you're missing what he's done. Deal with that. Thank you, Elon Bomani. multi-linear. Ukraine is an imperialist war by Russia to take over a sovereign state outright rather than control through an installed puppet. It's more complicated than that. The Ukraine war, and the Pope said this, by the way, I'm not basing my position on him. We just happen to agree that America is really responsible for what happened in Ukraine and what's happening right now. And basically what brought on this war was the United States, after the collapse of the Union of Socialist Republics under the Clinton administration, making the decision to take former members of the USSR, take them into NATO, and then plant NATO on the borders of Russia. This system had fallen that they called communist. Really wasn't, but that's what they called it. And Russia wanted to be admitted to the European Union and probably would have gone along with being admitted to NATO. But America continued to treat Russia as an enemy. And so they surrounded it. And then they overturned elections in Ukraine and installed a government that was right-wing, whereas the government before, it was 2014, the government that was in power before was leaning both ways, Russia and the US. Russia had proposed to give Ukraine money and suggested that the US provide the rest. And the US said no. You had John McCain in there prior to his death, supporting these right-wing elements. The US position on Ukraine, being in NATO and being in the European Union, they haven't been for it, but they have dangled the carrot like they would be for it. So when you see the initial invasion of Ukraine by Russia, they're doing it because they want to discourage Ukraine from joining NATO and the European Union. And with the Turks serving the mediating role, they negotiated an agreement to do that, that they would pull their troops out because in the beginning they didn't hit hard. The America said because they underestimated the Ukrainians, all the rest. No, they were around a bargaining table and the Ukrainians were getting ready to sign off on an agreement where they agreed not to join NATO, particularly. I said this before. The United States sent Boris Johnson, who was a prime minister of England, who's a joke, who played a big role in the British withdrawing from Brexit, from the European Union, supporting Brexit. And he was sent by Joe Biden and the Biden administration to tell the Ukrainians that if they sign an agreement with Russia, America and the European Union would turn their backs on Ukraine. Now, because the head of Ukraine is a comedian, ain't no comedian fit to be president of anything. He bowed to the pressure. So what if America doesn't give you some money for a while? So what if the European Union doesn't? Is it better to have a part of your country bombed out? And so that's what caused this particular war. I'm not pro-Putin. I'm pro-African. I'm pro-right. Whatever you get from me, I'll do my homework and tell you this is my judgment, right? So this move to have peace in Ukraine is correct because right now, Russia has Ukraine in pieces, P-I-E-C-E-S. Ukraine is a mouse going up against the Russian elephant. It was stupid for the Ukrainian leadership to have ever fallen for the pressure. And why did Biden and his team say they wanted this war to go on? To weaken Russia. At whose expense? And of course, to line the pockets of the military industrial complex, because all the weapons go in there, the money that's coming from the US Treasury is going to the weapons industry, And who's dying? It's the Ukrainians. So this is a war that needs to end. I don't care who supports that position. I'm not taking it because of whoever supports it. It's because that's the best way out for them. See if there's anything else here. Oh, please. This whole bit about Putin is going after Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and Finland. Finland was scared into joining NATO. Sweden has too. And what that's going to lead to is a lowering of the standard of living, particularly for the Swedes. The Swedes have one of the highest standards of living in the world. And, the U.S. insists that a certain percentage of the budget be put into the military, 2%, but they really want 5%. And that impoverishes the people. Western Europeans are living better than people in this country because they don't have a military industrial complex to pay for everything. And nothing is left for the people. Milty Leonard says the U.S. isn't responsible for the war in Ukraine. It's responsible for not allowing a peace to happen. Because let me tell you what's going to happen. I'm a strategist. This is an easy one to predict. When a peace is settled in Ukraine, and it's going to be real soon, the Ukrainians are going to sign off on not joining NATO. That's the only way Russia's going to agree to anything. And so why fight a war over that when, first of all, they've already admitted Finland. But Ukraine has wanted to be a member of NATO for the longest, but they haven't admitted them. Why? Because they know that's too much trouble. Because they share a border with Russia. Because it's a corrupt country. There's a lot of reasons. You understand? Huh? So what they're going to end up getting is what they could have got in the beginning. This is poor leadership. And I've been telling people this from the beginning. A mouse does not fight an elephant. That's a basic rule in war. And if they do, it's guerrilla war. But in this case, you don't. America's to blame for this thing, and bad leadership in Ukraine. And yes, I think Putin is no good. But one thing he is smart. And America has, they said they're going to weaken him. Yeah, they've lost a lot of lives in this war, but they have also been able to stand up to America and sanctions and everything else. So that's it. Robin, William Bradley is my slave name. The point is, if it says go to this particular Cash App, just do it. Okay, that's it. Hotep, until next week.